comment a little bit, first I'd like to thank very much the ladies who have been doing the translation all day. I think they've done a very competent job, so thank you to them, and thank you to the sponsors. But to most directly, I mean, it's clearly a very dynamic environment. There's a lot changing in where value is created and how service providers address that. In fact, maybe the whole conference should be called Do You SEPA in a Dynamic and Fragmenting Market? I mean, a lot of what SEPA and the journey of SEPA, as we've heard earlier today, it's been 10 years, 12 years. We say perhaps that the last mile is the most difficult, and where many issues are coming up, not the least of which is the essential requirements. I know that an airplane left I think 1 hour ago for Brussels, and I think it took half of the room going to the hearing there in Brussels. But I mean, there's a lot of elements, if I could just address exactly the point. There are a lot of drivers which are changing in the banking environment and the payment space. And that's causing, I think, a big rethink about how to create value in a profitable way and serving clients in a very highly competitive marketplace. There's a lot of competition on price, and there's a struggle for market share, and there's many things that are happening in the competitive space. But at the same time, behind the scenes, there's a changing regulatory environment. We heard earlier about Basel III and the impact that's going to have, but there are many regulations that are having an impact on what will be the cost basis, on the profitability of the business of payments. And this is causing a real fundamental rethink about the core business model, because it is a business. And we heard even, I think Simon referred to the convention in Amsterdam, CityPoste, for the banking, at which payments were discussed, and there was an enormously different conversation between banks looking at each other as partners, and banks talking to vendors, and banks figuring out how they can manage these issues as well in a fundamental way. Intellectually, those issues have been there year after year, but I think the changing environment now is causing really a lot of rethink. It is, I think, increasingly a struggle for the value chain. It's not just about payments and settlement. Of course, that's what it's all about. It's been a difficult road to reach the SEPA credit transfer, direct debit, et cetera, and we have to complete that work. But I think looking at what Veronica showed, and as I think D3, which is the new world, if you call it that, of payments, and many new potential providers. Are they trying to get into the payment space, or are they trying to get into the value space, which includes payments? There's still money to be made at payments themselves, but it's in a way a lot more interesting, and especially if you're looking at new entrants, not to just enter into a commoditizing space for payments, but it's how you bring value in a broader sense and develop a franchise which is highly relevant to customers, because that's really only the basis at which this can be sustainable, and from a new entrant's point of view. This also raises a lot of issues. Obviously, core to this transformation and core potentially to the new entrants arriving in a more fragmented market has been technology. I mean, yes, we could talk about regulation and we could talk about SEPA again, but I think it's a confluence of many factors coming to play at the same time. And absolutely, it's the promise of the web and the promise of the technology that's now giving new reach to new customer franchises with a completely different value proposition that I think is really going to frame the payment space. And the banks are figuring out, I personally believe this is a banking business, payments is. It's so core to client activities. I mean, we've seen some elements of payments, for example, processing of cards. Card processing has become It's still a banking business, but there are now specialized big processors that are quite good at that. So is that the way the core payments business will go as well? No doubt that settlement, which in some respects is not the most interesting element of it. It is more about the client relationship and how you develop it and how you bring value to the client and to your own institution. But there's a lot of elements at play that affect that, that as well. There are a lot of things that we haven't talked about. There was one slide earlier about fraud, and I think this is, I mean, one element of a fragmenting marketplace, if I could call it that. On the one hand, its scale is important, it's centralizing, but a lot of new entrants and new technology means that it's also fragmenting. And I don't know, a lot of these technologies are very new. We talk about M-payment and E-payment, but there's a lot of new technology and new fraudsters that are seeking also to undermine this. So the one thing that we can say, I don't want to get into the debate about too big to fail. That's another debate. But what I can say, what we've seen from the crisis, is that the payments business itself has done really well. It almost seems that it was an agenda of the regulators in advance that they preferred a consolidation, at least of the payments business. They prefer competition, and there's been a lot of competition, but they seem to prefer a consolidation around highly competent, high technology providers. And I think that's one of the things that as we go into a new fragmented environment, it is certainly fraud is one thing that we need to watch. And that's also one of the key elements that we have to think about as we look at new business models, exciting ideas, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of elements of the good old-fashioned banking and payment processes that need to be considered. So I think that might be my opening remark about the changing environment.
Grazie.